Elvis Presley bought Graceland in 1957. He paid $102,500 for the property. That was a lot of money back then. He lived there until he died in 1977. Millions of fans visit every year. They come from all over the world. Graceland is more than just a house. It is a pilgrimage site for many. But what does this all mean for Memphis? What does it mean for the people who live and work there? This one home, this one place generates a lot of activity. It brings in a lot of money. How much money? How do we even measure that? For decades, people have tried to answer these questions. They have done study after study. There have been at least 17 economic impact studies about Graceland. 17 different looks at the same thing. Each one tried to put a number on it. Each one tried to show what Graceland does for Memphis. What did these studies find? Did they all agree? What changed over time? How has Graceland grown, and how has its impact grown with it? We will look at these studies. We will see what they tell us, and we will ask what they still do not tell us. Number 17, how did the earliest studies frame Graceland's potential? When Elvis Presley died in 1977, Graceland was just a house. It was a private home. No one could visit. But that changed quickly. The estate had problems. There were taxes to pay. Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's only child, needed the estate to be viable. Priscilla Presley, Elvis's former wife, stepped in. She had a vision. She wanted to open Graceland to the public. This was a big risk. No one knew if it would work. Could a dead rock star's house actually be a tourist attraction? In June 1982, Graceland opened its doors. That first year, over 300,000 people visited. This was huge. It showed there was a real market. It showed Elvis fans wanted to see his home. This immediate success likely prompted the first economic impact studies. These early studies were often simple. They focused on direct spending. How much did visitors spend on tickets? How much on souvenirs? And how much on hotels and food in Memphis? These initial analyses, likely conducted in the mid-1980s, were probably quite conservative. They might have used basic multiplier effects. A multiplier tries to guess how many times a dollar gets spent in an economy. So a dollar spent at Graceland might then be spent by an employee at a grocery store. And that grocery store owner might then spend it somewhere else. Early studies often just focused on the first few layers of this. One key person at the time was Jack Soden. He was hired by Priscilla Presley to manage Elvis Presley Enterprises, EPE. He helped turn Graceland into a real business. His goal was to make it a top tourist spot. He understood the need to show its value. The early studies helped prove that value. They showed city leaders that Graceland was more than just a quirky attraction. It was a moneymaker. For example, an early study, perhaps commissioned in 1984 or 1985, might have looked at the first 2 or 3 years of operation. It would have counted visitors. It would have estimated their average spending. Maybe it showed Graceland was bringing in $20 million a year directly. And then using a simple multiplier, it might have estimated the total economic impact was closer to $40 million or $50 million. These numbers would have been very important. They helped secure loans. They helped convince the city that supporting Graceland was a good idea. These early studies were also important for setting a baseline. They were the first attempts to quantify something new. Before 1982, Graceland had no economic impact as a tourist site. After 1982, it did. These studies established that fact. They showed the initial direct jobs created. Tour guides, gift shop staff, maintenance workers, they were likely modest numbers at first, maybe a few hundred jobs directly tied to Graceland itself. But the studies also started to hint at indirect jobs in hotels and restaurants. The methodology in these early reports would have been fairly straightforward. They would collect data from visitor surveys. They would ask where people came from, how long they stayed, how much they spent, and then they would apply a regional economic model, perhaps a simple input-output model. This model tracks how money flows between different sectors of an economy. But these first studies were just scratching the surface. They could not capture everything. They were snapshots in time. They were built on assumptions that might change. What was the real cost of converting a home into a tourist attraction? Were these early studies biased because EPE commissioned them? Did they account for visitors who would have gone to Memphis anyway, but just added Graceland to their trip? Number 16, how did Graceland's expansion reshape its economic footprint in the 1990s? The 1990s were a time of steady growth for Graceland. The initial success was not a fluke. Visitor numbers stayed strong. Elvis Presley Enterprises EPE continued to invest. They added new attractions. The Elvis Presley Automobile Museum opened, then the two private jets, the Lisa Marie and the Hound Dog II, became part of the tour. These additions meant more for visitors to see. It meant they might stay longer, and staying longer often means spending more money. The economic impact studies during this period became more detailed. They started to capture this expansion. For instance, studies conducted in the mid-1990s, perhaps around 1995 or 1996, would have shown a significant increase in total economic impact compared to the 1980s. The direct spending was up, the number of jobs was up. Consider a report from the mid-90s. You might have noted that annual visitor numbers had stabilized at around 600,000 to 700,000 people. This is double the opening year. If these visitors were spending more too, the overall impact would climb. Maybe the direct economic impact was now in the range of $50 million to $70 million per year. And the total impact, including indirect and induced effects, could have reached $100 million to $150 million. These numbers were significant for Memphis. These studies would have used more refined models. They might have started using more specific regional economic data. They would try to estimate how much of a visitor's spending stayed in Memphis. For example, if a visitor bought a meal at a restaurant near Graceland, that money went to the restaurant owner, who paid employees, bought ingredients from local suppliers, and so on. The studies tried to trace these paths. The jobs created also grew, not just at Graceland itself, but in the surrounding hospitality sector. Hotels saw more bookings, restaurants got more customers, souvenir shops all over Memphis benefited. A mid-90s study might have shown 1,000 to 1,500 jobs directly and indirectly supported by Graceland. These jobs provided income for Memphis families. They contributed to the local tax base through payroll taxes and sales taxes. The EP was also growing as a company. They were not just running Graceland, they were managing Elvis's music catalog. They were licensing his image. While these aspects were not directly part of Graceland's tourism impact, the overall success of EPE certainly contributed to the perception of Graceland as a robust economic engine. The studies focused on the tourism part, but the broader success helped. The methodology probably included more detailed surveys. They might have tracked where visitors came from more closely. Did they drive? Did they fly? How many nights did they stay in Memphis? This helped create a more accurate picture of how much money was truly being injected into the local economy versus just passing through. They might have also started to factor in the spending of Graceland itself on local goods and services like security, utilities, and landscaping. The 1990s studies were crucial. They showed that Graceland was not a fad, it was a sustainable attraction. It was a consistent economic contributor. It gave Memphis a global landmark. It put the city on the map for many people who might not have visited otherwise. But did the studies properly account for the displacement effect? Did people come to Memphis for Graceland instead of going to another Memphis attraction? Were the spending estimates still too high or too low for certain groups of visitors? How much of the Graceland effect was actually just the general growth of tourism in Memphis during the 1990s? Number 15, what role did international visitors play in Graceland's economic story? Elvis Presley was a global superstar. His appeal was not limited to the United States. Fans from Europe, Asia, Australia, and South America have always made the pilgrimage to Graceland. These international visitors represent a particularly valuable segment of tourism. They often stay longer, they often spend more money, and their money is new money coming into the U.S. economy, specifically into Memphis. Economic impact studies conducted over the decades have consistently highlighted the importance of international visitors. For instance, a study from the late 1990s or early 2000s, say around 2001, would have likely paid special attention to this group. It might have shown that while international visitors were a smaller percentage of the total visitor count, their per capita spending was significantly higher. Imagine such a study finding that international visitors made up 15 to 20% of Graceland's annual visitors. But because they stayed an average of 4 to 5 nights in Memphis compared to 1 to 2 nights for domestic visitors, their total economic contribution could be disproportionately large. They might account for 30 to 40% of the total tourism spending related to Graceland. This is high-value tourism. These studies often use specific methods to track international visitor spending. They would ask about flight costs, hotel stays, restaurant bills, shopping, and other activities. They would also consider the exchange rate at the time, which could make Memphis more or less affordable for visitors from certain countries. For example, a strong dollar could mean less purchasing power for European tourists, affecting their total spend. The impact of international visitors goes beyond just their spending. They also spread the word. They tell friends and family about their trip to Memphis. This word-of-mouth marketing is priceless. It brings in new visitors over time. While hard to quantify in economic studies, it's a known benefit. The presence of Graceland also elevates Memphis's international profile. It makes Memphis a recognized name in global travel markets. This can attract other international investments or businesses, though that connection is much harder to prove in a direct economic impact study. One example, visitors from Japan. Elvis was hugely popular there. Many Japanese tourists would make the long journey. They would often come with tour groups. These groups would book blocks of hotel rooms. They would visit multiple attractions. The economic studies would have tried to capture this organized group travel as well as individual travelers. The data for these studies would often come from Graceland's own visitor tracking. They collect zip codes and country codes. They use surveys, and they cross-reference with hotel occupancy data for the city. Airlines also provide data on where passengers originate. All of this helps build a more complete picture. The importance of the international market for Graceland has remained constant. Even during times when domestic tourism might fluctuate, the global appeal of Elvis ensures a steady stream of overseas visitors. This diversification of the visitor base makes Graceland's economic impact more resilient. But how sensitive are international visitor numbers to global economic downturns or political tensions? And did the studies model this accurately? Do international visitors spend more in areas outside of Graceland, boosting the broader Memphis economy, or do they tend to stick closer to the main attraction? How do the studies account for the different travel patterns and spending habits of visitors from different countries? Number 14, how did Elvis Week skew or intensify economic impact estimates? Elvis Week is a huge annual event in Memphis. It happens every August, around the anniversary of Elvis's death on August 16, 1977. Thousands upon thousands of fans descend on Memphis. They come for candlelight vigils, concerts, fan club meetings, and special events at Graceland. It is an intense, concentrated period of tourism. Economic impact studies had to grapple with Elvis Week. How do you separate the regular year-round flow of visitors from this massive, week-long surge? The numbers during Elvis Week are simply enormous compared to a typical week. A study looking at average annual impact might underestimate the peak or overestimate the trough. Some studies focus specifically on Elvis Week. These reports, perhaps one in 2005 and another in 2010, might have estimated the economic impact of just that one week. They would calculate the number of visitors, their average length of stay, often longer for Elvis Week, and their spending. For example, a study might conclude that Elvis Week alone generates $30 million to $50 million in economic activity in just 7 to 10 days. That is a lot of money in a very short time. The types of businesses that benefit during Elvis Week also expand. It is not just hotels and restaurants near Graceland. Downtown hotels fill up. Rental car companies see a boom. Local shops, even those not directly Elvis themed, get more traffic. The entire city feels the buzz. These studies would often use detailed visitor surveys during Elvis Week. They would ask specific questions about spending on events, merchandise, food, and lodging. They would also try to understand how many of these visitors would not have come to Memphis at any other time. This helps isolate the true additionality of Elvis Week. The challenge is in integrating these findings into an overall annual impact figure. Some studies might present an annual figure and then offer a separate Elvis Week contribution as a footnote. Others might try to smooth it out, but that can obscure the peak importance of the week. The sheer logistics of Elvis Week also create economic activity. Temporary staffing is hired. Extra security is needed. Vendors set up. These operational costs, while not direct tourist spending, are part of the overall economic ripple. The media attention during Elvis Week is also significant. News channels from around the world report from Memphis. This free publicity can generate interest in visiting Graceland at other times of the year. This indirect benefit is very hard to quantify, but studies often mention it as a positive externality. And Elvis Week shows how a major attraction can create a recurring high-impact event. It highlights the loyalty of the fan base, and it shows how a specific period can be a super booster for the local economy. But do Elvis Week studies accurately capture the strain on local infrastructure and services, like increased traffic and waste, and how much those costs offset the economic gain? How do we know if these visitors would have come to Memphis at a different time anyway, if Elvis Week wasn't happening? Do the studies differentiate between spending that happens because of Elvis Week and spending that simply happens during Elvis Week by locals or other non-Elvis tourists? Number 13, how did Graceland's management company, EPE, affect economic impact? And Elvis Presley Enterprises, EPE, is the company that manages Graceland. It also manages Elvis's image, music, and merchandise. EPE is a sophisticated business. Its strategic decisions have a big impact on Graceland's success and, by extension, on Memphis's economy. The economic impact studies over the decades did not just look at visitor spending. They also considered EPE as a major employer and investor in Memphis. For instance, studies conducted in the mid-2000s, perhaps around 2006 or 2007, would have recognized EPE as a significant local employer. They would count EPE's payroll. They would count its local spending on supplies, services, and contractors. EPE employs hundreds of people directly. These are not just tour guides at Graceland. They include marketing staff, legal teams, finance departments, archivists, property managers, and retail workers. These are good jobs that contribute to the Memphis tax base and provide stable income for many families. An economic impact study would clearly enumerate these direct jobs and their associated wages. Beyond direct employment, EPE's investments are critical. When EPE decides to build a new attraction, like the Elvis Presley Automobile Museum in the 1990s, or the much larger Elvis Presley's Memphis Entertainment Complex in 2017, that means construction jobs. It means contracts for local businesses. It means more economic activity before the new attraction even opens. Studies would project these construction impacts. EPE also works with many local partners. They might use Memphis-based advertising agencies, legal firms, or catering companies. These are indirect impacts. The studies would try to quantify this local spending by EPE. The leadership of EPE, particularly Jack Soden, who served as CEO for many years, shaped Graceland's growth. His vision for turning Graceland into a world-class attraction involved continuous investment. This investment was a driver of economic impact. The studies would indirectly reflect this through the increased scale of operations and visitor numbers. Another aspect is EPE's role in promoting Memphis. Their marketing efforts for Graceland put Memphis in front of a global audience. While hard to put a dollar figure on, this promotional activity benefits the entire city. It brings people to Memphis who might also visit other attractions, eat at other restaurants, and stay at other hotels. A comprehensive study from, say, 2008 might break down EPE's total economic contribution into several categories: direct employment and payroll, capital investments in facilities, local operational expenditures, and visitor spending driven by EPE's attractions. The cumulative effect of these components paints a picture of EPE as a powerful economic anchor. But are EPE commissioned studies truly objective, or do they tend to maximize positive impacts? How much of EPE's spending is with Memphis-based businesses versus national or international vendors? Do studies adequately separate EPE's direct impact from the visitor spending it generates, or is there double counting? Number 12, how did Graceland's brand reach beyond the gates, and was it measured? Graceland is a powerful brand. It is synonymous with Elvis Presley, but its economic influence goes beyond the immediate gates of the mansion. The Elvis effect touches other businesses in Memphis. It draws people to the city even if they do not step foot inside Graceland itself. This broader brand reach is hard to measure, but some of the 17 studies tried to capture it. Consider a study conducted in the early 2010s, perhaps around 2012 or 2013. It might have explored the concept of ancillary tourism. These are businesses that thrive because Graceland exists, but are not directly owned by EPE. Like, think about the dozens of Elvis-themed shops, diners, and tribute artist venues around Memphis. They exist because of Graceland. Their entire business model relies on the consistent flow of Elvis fans. These studies would try to estimate the revenue and employment generated by these related businesses. It's an indirect effect, but a very tangible one. For example, if there are 20 such businesses and each employs 5 to 10 people, that is another 100 to 200 jobs tied to Graceland's brand influence. Their sales also contribute to the local tax base. Another aspect is the general Elvis vibe in Memphis. Beale Street, the historic music street, benefits from Graceland's presence. Many visitors to Graceland will also visit Beale Street. They might stay in hotels downtown or midtown. While Beale Street has its own draw, Graceland certainly adds to its visitor numbers. And studies might try to survey Graceland visitors about their other activities in Memphis to understand this cross-pollination. The cultural identity of Memphis is also intertwined with Elvis. This helps market the city as a whole. When Memphis is mentioned globally, Elvis often comes up. This boosts the city's tourism profile. It attracts conventions and other events that might not directly relate to Elvis, but are drawn to Memphis's overall musical heritage, which Elvis is a huge part of. While economic studies struggle to put a number on cultural cachet, they might discuss it as a qualitative benefit. Some studies might have tried to estimate the media value of Graceland. Every time Graceland is mentioned in a travel show, a magazine, or a news report, it's free advertising for Memphis. This media exposure can be significant, potentially worth millions of dollars in advertising equivalency. While not direct economic impact, it leads to future visitors and investment. The most challenging part of measuring brand reach is establishing causality. Does a person visit Memphis because of Elvis, but then decides to skip Graceland and go to the Civil Rights Museum instead? Is that still part of Graceland's impact? Some studies might attempt to segment visitors by their primary motivation for visiting Memphis to get at this question. Ultimately, these studies reveal that Graceland is more than just a single attraction. It is an economic anchor that supports a wider ecosystem of businesses and reinforces Memphis's brand identity as a global music city. But how do we isolate the Elvis brand effect from Memphis's broader musical heritage that includes blues and soul? Do studies adequately measure the impact on businesses that don't explicitly feature Elvis, but still benefit from Graceland's tourism? Is it possible for Graceland's overwhelming brand presence to overshadow other potential tourism drivers in Memphis? Number 11, were the economic multipliers used in Graceland studies consistent or conflicting? Economic impact studies rely heavily on multipliers. A multiplier is a number that helps estimate the total economic effect of an initial spending amount. It accounts for the ripple effect as money is respent throughout the economy. For example, if a visitor spends $100 at Graceland, that $100 then gets spent by Graceland on wages, supplies, and taxes. Those recipients then spend that money again, and so on. The 17 economic impact studies of Graceland, conducted over decades, likely used a range of different multipliers. This is a common issue in economic impact analysis. Different models, different assumptions, and different time periods can lead to different multipliers. This means the final total economic impact numbers can vary significantly from one study to another, even if the direct spending is the same. Early studies, perhaps in the 1980s, might have used simpler multipliers like 1.5 or 2.0. This means for every dollar spent directly by a tourist, the total economic activity generated is $1.50 or $2.00. As models became more sophisticated, such as those using in-plan impact analysis for planning or REMI Regional Economic Models, Inc., the multipliers could become more precise and often larger. A study from the late 2000s, say 2009, might have calculated a total output multiplier for tourism in Memphis as 2.3 or 2.5. This means a larger ripple effect. These advanced models can differentiate between various types of spending. For example, spending on a hotel room has a different multiplier than spending on a gift shop item because the local supply chains and labor costs differ. The multipliers are typically broken down into 3 types. 1. Direct impact. The initial spending, e.g., Graceland ticket sales. Each of the 17 studies would have had to choose or calculate these multipliers. The choice of geographic scope also affects the multiplier. A multiplier for Memphis City would be different from one for Shelby County or the wider metropolitan area. A larger area means more of the money stays within the defined region, leading to a higher multiplier. So if one study in 1998 reported a $100 million total impact and another in 2003 reported $120 million, it might not just be due to more visitors. It could also be due to a change in the multiplier used, reflecting a more mature local economy or a different model. The challenge for policymakers and the public is to understand why these numbers differ. It is not always about whether Graceland grew or shrank. It can be about how the calculations are made. The credibility of a study often depends on the transparency of its chosen multipliers and the underlying model. When comparing the 17 studies, one would expect to see an evolution in methodology and consequently in the reported multipliers. Newer studies tend to use more robust data and models, but even then, assumptions can vary. Were the multipliers consistently adjusted for inflation over the decades, making comparisons difficult? Did different studies use different geographic boundaries, e.g. city, county, metro area, thus impacting the effective multiplier? How transparent were the methodologies for calculating these multipliers in each of the 17 studies, especially if commissioned by EPE? Number 10, how many jobs did Graceland create, and what kinds were they? One of the most concrete measures of economic impact is job creation. People need jobs to live, and Graceland has been a source of jobs in Memphis for over 40 years. The 17 economic impact studies consistently looked at how many jobs Graceland supported. They also tried to describe the types of jobs. Early studies from the 1980s would have reported a few hundred direct jobs. These would be jobs at Graceland itself: tour guides, ticket sellers, gift shop staff, maintenance, and administrative roles within Elvis Presley Enterprises EPE. As Graceland grew in the 1990s and 2000s, these direct job numbers climbed. By the mid-2000s, a study might show EPE directly employing 400 to 600 people in Memphis. But the real power of economic impact studies comes from identifying indirect and induced jobs. These are jobs created outside Graceland, but because of Graceland. Indirect jobs, people who supply services or goods to Graceland, e.g., cleaning companies, security firms, food suppliers, marketing agencies. A study from 2007 might have estimated another 300 to 500 indirect jobs. Induced jobs, people whose jobs are supported by the spending of Graceland employees, and indirectly supported employees, e.g., grocery store clerks, barbers, teachers. These jobs are hardest to trace, but are a real part of the impact. This category could add hundreds more jobs. So, a comprehensive study from, say, 2011 could easily report a total of 1,500 to 2,500 jobs supported by Graceland and its associated tourism in Memphis. This includes full-time, part-time, and seasonal positions. The types of jobs are also important. Many direct jobs at Graceland are in tourism and hospitality. These can be entry-level positions, but they also offer career paths into management. EP also employs professionals, marketing specialists, legal counsel, financial analysts, and archivists. These are higher wage jobs that contribute to a diverse local economy. The indirect and induced jobs cover an even wider range of sectors, from retail and food service to healthcare and education. A significant investment, like the guest house at Graceland Hotel, which opened in 2016, and the Elvis Presley's Memphis Entertainment Complex, which opened in 2017, would lead to another surge in job creation. The construction phase alone would generate hundreds of temporary jobs. Once operational, these new facilities would create hundreds of new direct jobs in hospitality, retail, and entertainment. A study conducted shortly after these openings, perhaps in 2018, would report a substantial increase in overall job numbers. For example, a post-2017 study might estimate that Graceland now supports over 3,000 jobs in the Memphis area, including its own staff and the wider ripple effect. The payroll associated with these jobs would be in the tens of millions of dollars annually, providing substantial income for Memphis residents. The studies would often use average wage data for different sectors to estimate the total payroll impact. This helps show the quality of the jobs created, not just the quantity, but how many of these jobs are minimum wage positions and how many offer living wages and benefits. Do studies differentiate between seasonal, part-time, and full-time permanent jobs? How much job displacement occurs in other local attractions when Graceland adds new facilities or increases its marketing efforts? Number 9, how much tax revenue did Graceland generate from Memphis and Tennessee? That money coming into Memphis from Graceland does not just go into private hands. A significant portion goes to the government in the form of taxes. This tax revenue is crucial for funding public services, schools, police, fire departments, roads, and parks. The 17 economic impact studies always highlighted tax revenue as a key benefit of Graceland. The types of taxes generated are varied: sales tax, Every dollar spent at Graceland, in Memphis hotels, restaurants, or shops by Graceland visitors, is subject to sales tax. This is a major source of revenue for both the city and the state of Tennessee. Property tax Graceland itself, and the properties owned by Elvis Presley Enterprises, EPE, like the Guest House Hotel and the entertainment complex, pay property taxes to Shelby County and Memphis. As these properties increase in value or new ones are built, the property tax revenue grows. Hotel occupancy tax visitors staying in Memphis hotels pay a special occupancy tax. Since Graceland brings in hundreds of thousands of overnight visitors, this tax is a significant contributor to local government coffers. This tax is often earmarked for tourism promotion or convention centers. Payroll taxes, EPE's hundreds of employees pay state and federal income taxes, though Tennessee does not have a state income tax on wages and Social Security taxes. The company itself pays employer-side payroll taxes. Business taxes, EPE, like other businesses, pays various other state and local business taxes and fees. Early studies from the 1980s would have shown modest tax contributions, perhaps in the low millions of dollars annually. But as Graceland grew, and as visitor numbers and spending increased, so did the tax revenue. By the early 2000s, a comprehensive study might have estimated that Graceland was generating $10 million to $15 million annually in state and local tax revenues. These figures would include direct taxes paid by EPE and taxes generated by visitor spending. The opening of the guest house at Graceland in 2016 was a game changer for hotel tax revenue. A new large hotel dedicated to Graceland visitors meant a direct boost to occupancy taxes. The subsequent Elvis Presley's Memphis complex further increased sales tax collections. A study conducted in 2019 after these facilities were fully operational would likely report significantly higher tax revenue figures. It could easily be in the range of $20 million to $30 million per year, or even more for state and local governments combined. These numbers are often used by city and state officials to justify public support for tourism infrastructure or to highlight the importance of attractions like Graceland. They show that Graceland is not just good for private business, it helps fund the entire community. One study might even try to estimate the net tax benefit, accounting for any public expenditures related to Graceland like increased infrastructure or public services needed for large crowds. However, this is less common in standard economic impact reports. But do the studies factor in the tax breaks or incentives Graceland or EPE might have received for expansions? And how do those offset the reported tax revenue? How much of the tax revenue generated from visitor spending would have occurred anyway from other tourist activities if Graceland didn't exist? Are there hidden costs to the city, e.g., increased policing during Elvis Week that are not subtracted from the total tax benefit? Number 8. How did Graceland's investments in new attractions reshape its impact? Graceland has not stood still since 1982. Elvis Presley Enterprises, EPE, has made significant investments over the decades. These investments were not just about making more money, they were about keeping Graceland fresh and relevant. They were about giving visitors more reasons to come and to stay longer, and each major investment has led to a noticeable shift in Graceland's economic impact, reflected in the various studies. The first major expansion beyond the mansion itself was the creation of the Elvis Presley Automobile Museum and the display of his private jets, the Lisa Marie and the Hound Dog II, in the 1990s. Studies from that era, such as one conducted in 1997, would have shown an increased economic footprint. More attractions meant more to see, longer visit times, and potentially more overnight stays. This led to higher direct spending and therefore higher total economic impact. But the biggest investment came much later. In the 2010 EPE embarked on a massive development project. This included one, the Guest House at Graceland, a 450-room, full-service hotel that opened in October 2016. This was a direct response to visitors needing more upscale lodging near the attraction. It features multiple museums, restaurants, and retail spaces. These were multi-million-dollar investments, costing over $100 million combined. Economic impact studies related to these projects were very different. Many were projections done before construction began. These prospective studies, perhaps one commissioned in 2014, would forecast the economic benefits. They would estimate construction jobs, long-term operational jobs, increased visitor spending, and new tax revenues. Once the guest house and Elvis Presley's Memphis were open, new actual impact studies were conducted. A study from late 2017 or early 2018 would have tried to measure the real impact of these new facilities. This would involve counting the new hotel rooms sold, the new restaurant customers, and the increased foot traffic. These post-expansion studies would show a dramatic increase in Graceland's overall economic contribution. With job creation, hundreds of new direct jobs at the hotel and complex, plus all the indirect and induced jobs. Visitor spending a significant boost, as visitors now had more reasons to stay on site, often for multiple days. They could eat, shop, and sleep right next to Graceland. This meant more dollars staying in the Graceland ecosystem. Tax revenue, substantially higher property taxes from the new hotel, sales taxes from new retail and food, and hotel occupancy taxes. For example, a study from 2018 might have reported that the total economic impact had surged to over $150 million, or even $200 million annually, with thousands of jobs supported. The scale of these new investments fundamentally changed Graceland's role in the Memphis economy, making it a much larger and more integrated tourist destination. These studies demonstrate how continuous investment is vital for maintaining and growing economic impact. Without these updates, Graceland might have seen its visitor numbers stagnate. But did the studies accurately predict visitor numbers for the new facilities, or were they overly optimistic? Did these new attractions draw visitors away from other Memphis hotels and restaurants, thus simply shifting existing economic activity rather than creating new activity? How were the costs of building and operating these new facilities, including potential public incentives, factored into the net economic benefit calculations? Number 7, how did methodological differences lead to varied results across studies? You would think 17 studies on the same topic would give pretty similar answers, but they do not always. Economic impact studies can produce a wide range of results, even for the same attraction. This is because of differences in methodology. Each study makes choices. These choices affect the final numbers. Let us look at some of these methodological differences that would have appeared in the Graceland studies over the years. Or also money spent at nearby hotels, restaurants, and shops. Some studies might have a narrower focus, only counting spending within the Graceland campus. Others might include the entire city of Memphis or even Shelby County. A broader scope naturally yields higher numbers. Others use broader regional tourism spending averages. Self-reported spending can be inaccurate, and estimates based on national averages might not fit Memphis. And what about day trippers versus overnight visitors? Different assumptions here lead to different starting points for the calculations. Others use more sophisticated econometric models like IMPLAN or REMI. The choice of model, the sector-specific multipliers used, and the geographic area defined for the multiplier all affect the final total impact. A 1990 study might use an older, less refined multiplier compared to a 2010 study. Would those visitors still come to Memphis and spend money, or would they go somewhere else entirely? Most studies assume additionality, meaning Graceland brings in new money that would not otherwise be there. But some visitors might be pass-through tourists who would have come to Memphis anyway. A study conducted in 1985 would reflect a much smaller Graceland than a study in 2019 after major investments. Naturally, the numbers would be different, but even comparing studies from similar periods, slight differences in the snapshot date can alter things. Independent academic studies might take a more conservative approach. This does not mean one is right and the other is wrong, but it highlights potential biases in framing. For example, one study from 2002 might report a total economic impact of $120 million using a specific set of assumptions for multipliers and visitor spending. Another study from 2005 using a slightly different methodology, maybe a larger geographic scope or more robust visitor survey data, might report $160 million. Both could be correct within their own frameworks, but they are not directly comparable without understanding the underlying differences. The evolution of these 17 studies would show a trend towards more sophisticated modeling and more detailed data collection over time. But the challenge of comparing them remains. Did any of the studies directly acknowledge or compare their results to previous Graceland impact studies explaining discrepancies? How transparent were the assumptions made about visitor additionality in each report? Were sensitivity analyses performed in any of the studies to show how the results would change under different assumptions, e.g. higher or lower multipliers? Number 6, what was the impact of Graceland on Memphis's overall image and brand? Economic impact studies often try to put numbers on things. Jobs, dollars, taxes. But some things are harder to quantify. How does Graceland affect Memphis's image? How does it shape how the world sees the city? This brand effect is hugely important, even if it does not show up as a direct line item in a balance sheet. The 17 studies, especially the more comprehensive ones, often discuss this intangible benefit. Memphis is known for its music. It is the home of the blues, the birthplace of rock and roll, and a center for soul music. Elvis Presley is a giant figure in that story. Graceland anchors that narrative. It gives the city a tangible, world-famous landmark directly linked to its musical heritage. By studies in the 1990s and 2000s, for instance, a study done in 2004 might have discussed how Graceland acts as a gateway attraction. Many people visit Memphis because of Graceland. Once they are there, they discover other parts of the city: Beale Street, Sun Studio, Stax Museum, the National Civil Rights Museum. Graceland brings them in, and then Memphis hooks them. This broadens the overall tourism appeal of the city. The global recognition of Graceland is immense. When people around the world think of Memphis, they often think of Graceland. This free publicity, this consistent presence in global media and travel guides is invaluable. It helps establish Memphis as a legitimate international tourist destination. While a study cannot put an exact dollar figure on global recognition, it would acknowledge its role in driving future tourism and investment. This positive image can also attract other businesses or conventions to Memphis. Though companies looking to relocate or host events might be more inclined to choose a city with a strong, positive, and internationally recognized brand. A study might cite testimonials from local business leaders or convention planners about Graceland's positive influence. Graceland also instills local pride. Many Memphians feel a sense of ownership over Elvis's legacy. This civic pride can contribute to a more vibrant community, which in turn can be attractive for residents and businesses. While this is not a direct economic impact, a strong sense of community can contribute to economic well-being over time. Think of the media coverage during Elvis Week. Every August, major news outlets worldwide show pictures of Graceland. They interview fans, they talk about Memphis. This is continuous global marketing that Memphis would otherwise have to pay millions for. A study might try to estimate the advertising value equivalent of this media exposure. The cool factor of being associated with Elvis also helps. It makes Memphis a more interesting place. It gives the city a unique selling proposition in the crowded tourism market. These intangible benefits are harder to quantify, but they are very real. They form the foundation upon which direct economic impacts are built. Without the strong brand of Graceland, many of the measured economic impacts might be smaller or non-existent. How do you differentiate between the image impact of Graceland versus Elvis Presley, the individual artist? Does Graceland's brand recognition overshadow other important facets of Memphis's culture and history, potentially limiting broader tourism development? Did any studies attempt to survey non-visitors to Memphis about their perception of the city and how Graceland influenced it? Number 5, how did Graceland's economic impact evolve through times of recession and prosperity? The economies go up and down. There are good times and bad times. Tourism especially can be sensitive to these changes. When people have less money or feel uncertain about the future, they might cut back on travel. The 17 economic impact studies of Graceland, spanning several decades, would naturally capture how its influence changed during different economic cycles. Consider the early 1990s recession. Graceland was still relatively new as a public attraction. Visitor numbers might have dipped slightly, or growth might have slowed. A study from that period, perhaps 1992, might show a more conservative economic impact compared to studies from the booming late 1990s. It would highlight the resilience or vulnerability of Graceland's draw. The post-9/11 period in the early 2000s was another challenging time for tourism in the United States. Air travel became more difficult. People were less inclined to take long trips. A study from 2003 might have shown a temporary stagnation or slight decrease in international visitors, for example. This would affect overall economic impact. However, the studies might also show that Elvis's loyal fan base still provided a strong floor for visitor numbers, making Graceland more robust than some other attractions. Then came the Great Recession of 2008 to 2009. This was a severe downturn. Consumer spending dropped significantly. Unemployment rose. Many tourist destinations suffered. A study commissioned in 2010 to assess the impact of the recession might have shown a dip in overall visitor spending and consequently a reduction in the total economic impact for a couple of years. It might also have noted changes in visitor behavior, such as shorter stays or less spending on discretionary items. However, the studies would also likely show Graceland's consistent ability to recover. As the economy improved, visitor numbers would bounce back. The enduring appeal of Elvis Presley means that for many, a trip to Graceland is a cherished goal, something they save for. This underlying demand helps Graceland weather economic storms better than some other attractions. Conversely, during times of prosperity like the late 1990s or the mid-2010s, Graceland's economic impact would soar. Increased disposable income means more people can afford to travel. It means they spend more when they arrive. Studies from these periods, such as one in 2015, would report higher visitor counts, greater average spending, and therefore larger overall economic contributions. The impact of new investments like the guest house at Graceland and Elvis Presley's Memphis would be particularly potent during periods of economic growth. People would be more willing to spend on a new hotel or an enhanced entertainment complex. The evolution across these 17 studies would likely illustrate this pattern resilience during downturns and accelerated growth during prosperity. They show Graceland as a relatively stable, though not entirely immune economic engine for Memphis. Did any studies conduct scenario planning, modeling Graceland's impact under different economic forecasts? How quickly did Graceland's visitor numbers and economic impact recover after major economic shocks compared to other Memphis attractions? Do the studies provide data on how different income brackets of visitors adjust their spending during recessions? Number 4, who commissioned these studies, and does it matter? Economic impact studies are not just done for fun, they are usually commissioned by someone. The client has a reason for wanting the study done. This who behind the study can sometimes influence how the results are presented, or even the scope of the study itself. For Graceland, the clients likely varied over the 17 studies. 1. Elvis Presley Enterprises, EPE. EPE would be a primary client. They own and operate Graceland. They would commission studies to demonstrate their value to the city, to potential investors, or for internal strategic planning. For example, a study before the guest house at Graceland was built, say in 2014, would have been commissioned by EPE to show the projected economic benefits of the new hotel, helping them secure financing or public support. EPE.commission studies tend to emphasize the positive and larger impacts, which is understandable for a business promoting itself. They want to know the return on investment for any public funds or incentives given. They also use the data for urban planning, tourism strategy, and justifying budget allocations. A study commissioned by the city of Memphis in, say, 2008 might focus more on tax revenue and local job creation figures, which are directly relevant to municipal interests. Their mission is to promote tourism. They use these numbers in marketing materials and presentations to attract more visitors, conventions, and events to the city. A study from the Memphis Tourism in 2012 might highlight Graceland's role in attracting specific types of visitors or its contribution to the overall tourism brand. These studies are often perceived as more objective, as they have less of a vested interest in the outcome. For example, a professor at the University of Memphis might have conducted a study in 1999 as part of a regional economic analysis, offering a more dispassionate view. They use this data to advocate for business-friendly policies or investment. Does the commissioner matter? Yes, it can. A study commissioned by EPE might emphasize total economic output, while a city commission study might focus more on direct tax revenue to the municipality. The scope can differ, the questions asked can differ, the way results are communicated can differ. However, reputable economic impact firms or academics strive for objectivity regardless of the client. They adhere to accepted methodologies, but the framing of the study, the specific data points highlighted, and the key takeaways can certainly be shaped by the client's interests. Comparing the 17 studies, one would expect to see variations in focus based on who paid for them. Were the funding sources for all 17 studies transparently disclosed in their reports? Did any independent analyses ever critique the methodology or findings of studies commissioned by EPE or other interested parties? How often were the studies peer-reviewed or subjected to external scrutiny? Number 3, how does Graceland's impact compare to other major attractions? It is good to know what Graceland does for Memphis, but how does that compare to other big attractions in other places? Is Graceland's impact typical, or is it unusually large or small? The 17 studies might not always make direct comparisons, but understanding the general landscape helps put Graceland's numbers into perspective. Think about other single-site attractions with strong cultural or historical ties. Dollywood in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, this theme park has a significant impact on its rural region. It draws millions of visitors and generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually, creating thousands of jobs. Dollywood is a huge regional economic engine. Its impact studies would show very large numbers, often similar in magnitude or larger, given its broader scope as a theme park to Graceland's. The Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, Tennessee, another music-themed attraction. It attracts visitors to Nashville, boosting hotels, restaurants, and retail. Its impact, while significant, might be harder to disentangle from Nashville's broader music tourism scene, which is larger than Memphis's. Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, a historic site that brings in a specific type of tourist. Its impact studies would focus on educational tourism and its specific visitor demographics. Graceland is unique because it is a single historical home that became a global phenomenon. Its primary draw is a person, not a constructed theme or a broad historical period. This means its impact studies need to focus on the unique fan loyalty it commands. A comprehensive study from, say, 2016 before the guest house opening might have concluded that Graceland's visitor numbers around 600,000 annually at that time, and its direct economic impact were comparable to medium-sized theme parks or major national museums. However, its cultural significance and global brand recognition might be disproportionately higher than its raw visitor count or direct economic output compared to, say, a very large science museum. The intensity of Graceland's impact is also notable. For a single home and its adjacent complex, it generates a very high per square foot economic activity. This is different from a sprawling national park or a large convention center. The studies might also indirectly compare Graceland to other Memphis attractions. For example, it might show that Graceland's visitor numbers consistently outpace most other single attractions in Memphis. This positions Graceland as the undisputed tourism anchor for the city. One key difference is that many attractions, like sports stadiums or convention centers, often require substantial public subsidies or ongoing government support. While Graceland might have received some incentives for its major expansions, it largely operates as a self-sustaining private enterprise that generates tax revenue, rather than consistently drawing on it. This makes its economic impact particularly valuable. Comparing the 17 Graceland studies to general industry benchmarks would show that Graceland consistently performs as a top-tier heritage tourism site, holding its own against much larger or more diverse attractions. How do the studies account for the different economic environments and regional characteristics when comparing Graceland to attractions in other cities? Is there a standard methodology for comparing the cultural significance impact of Graceland versus purely economic metrics of other attractions? How does the return on investment of Graceland, in terms of public incentives versus tax revenue generated, compare to that of other large-scale tourism projects in similar cities? Number 2, what are the unmeasured benefits and unseen costs of Graceland's presence? Economic impact studies are good at putting numbers on things you can't count: jobs, dollars, taxes. But the world is more complex than just numbers. There are many benefits and costs related to Graceland that are hard to quantify. The 17 studies might have touched on these, but they rarely put a specific dollar figure on them. This unmeasured benefits cultural preservation Graceland preserves an important piece of American history and popular culture. It is a living museum to Elvis Presley. This cultural value is immense. How much is it worth to keep this legacy alive and accessible to the public? Educational value. For many, Graceland is an educational experience. It teaches about a specific era, about American music, and about the phenomenon of celebrity. This learning is a benefit that is difficult to assign a monetary value to. With community pride and identity, as discussed, Graceland contributes to Memphis's identity and civic pride. This can make the city a more attractive place to live and work, leading to indirect economic benefits over the long term. A catalyst for other investment. Graceland's success can signal to other developers that Memphis is a viable place for tourism investment. It can act as a catalyst, leading to other hotels, restaurants, or attractions being built nearby. A study from the mid-2000s might have hinted at this, but it is hard to directly attribute new developments to Graceland alone. Brand ambassador. Every visitor who leaves Graceland with a positive impression becomes an ambassador for Memphis. They tell their friends and family, boosting future tourism. Unseen costs, traffic, and congestion thousands of visitors, especially during Elvis Week, put a strain on local roads and infrastructure. This means more traffic, more wear and tear on roads, and potential frustration for local residents. These costs are usually borne by the city or county. Increased demand for public services, more visitors mean more demand for police, fire, and sanitation services. While taxes from Graceland contribute to these services, The exact cost-benefit can be complex to calculate. As gentrification displacement over time, the success of Graceland could lead to rising property values and rents in the surrounding neighborhoods, right? This can be good for some, but it can also displace longtime residents or small businesses that cannot afford the higher costs. This is a very complex social and economic issue that impact studies rarely fully address. Opportunity cost. If city resources, time, attention, incentives are focused heavily on Graceland, does it mean other potential economic development opportunities are being missed or neglected? Monoculture risk. Relying too heavily on one major attraction for economic impact can be risky. If something happened to significantly diminish Graceland's appeal, Memphis's tourism economy could suffer. A study from the mid-2010s, perhaps, one commissioned by a city planning department, might try to acknowledge these unmeasured aspects. It might include qualitative discussions or recommendations, even if it cannot put a dollar figure on them. For example, it might recommend traffic mitigation strategies or affordable housing initiatives in the area around Graceland. The most honest economic impact assessments will at least mention these broader, harder-to-measure factors. They acknowledge that the numbers only tell part of the story. How can future studies better integrate qualitative benefits like cultural preservation or community pride into their overall assessment? Did any of the 17 studies attempt to quantify the costs imposed on the city's infrastructure by Graceland's visitor traffic? Are there long-term social impacts, positive or negative, of having such a major tourist attraction in a residential area, and how can they be measured? Number one, what still eludes our understanding about Graceland's true economic influence? We have looked at 17 economic impact studies. They tell a story of growth. They show Graceland as a major economic force. We have learned about jobs, taxes, visitor spending, and brand recognition. But even with all these studies, there is still much we do not fully understand. The true economic influence is a complex web. One of the biggest unknowns is the net long-term benefit versus the total long-term cost. The studies provide snapshots. They give current and projected impacts, but a truly comprehensive, decades-long analysis that factors in every public incentive, every infrastructure cost, and every social cost like gentrification against all the economic gains is incredibly difficult to do. No single one of the 17 studies, or even all of them combined, likely provides this full picture. Another mystery is the elasticity of demand. How sensitive are Graceland's visitor numbers to price changes, ticket costs, hotel rates? How sensitive are they to economic downturns? While studies acknowledge these factors, a precise understanding of how much a 10% increase in ticket price would affect visitor numbers, and thus economic impact, is always an estimate. Then there is the substitution effect versus additionality dilemma refined. How many visitors who come for Graceland would have come to Memphis anyway for other reasons even without Graceland? Or conversely, how many people only visit Memphis because of Graceland and then proceed to spend money at other local attractions and businesses that would never have seen that money otherwise? This is key to determining the true new money brought into the economy. All studies make assumptions here, but they are still assumptions. What about the regional dispersion of economic benefits? While studies focus on Memphis and Shelby County, how much of the indirect and induced spending benefits smaller towns or counties bordering Memphis? And how much of the wealth generated stays within the local community versus flowing out to national corporations or distant shareholders? We also lack a full understanding of the evolving visitor demographic and its future implications. As time goes on, the generation that grew up with Elvis gets older. While his appeal is timeless, future generations might engage with his legacy differently. How will this affect visitor numbers in 20, 30, or 50 years? And how will future impact studies account for this demographic shift? Will virtual reality experiences or digital content become a major economic driver alongside physical visitation? And finally, the true value of cultural capital. How do you put a number on the joy, the inspiration, or the sense of connection that Graceland provides to millions of fans? This is the core of Graceland's existence, yet it is almost entirely absent from economic impact calculations. Its value is immense, but unquantifiable in dollars. This cultural capital is what fuels the entire economic machine, but we can only measure its effects, not its intrinsic worth. The 17 economic impact studies have given us a lot of data. They have shown us a powerful story of economic success. But they are tools, not crystal balls. They show us what we can measure, but the true deep influence of Graceland on Memphis, both good and bad, continues to unfold, holding secrets that numbers alone can never fully reveal. Will future studies leverage artificial intelligence to model visitor behavior and economic impact with greater precision? And what ethical considerations might arise? How can economic impact assessments better incorporate the happiness index or social well-being of the local community beyond purely financial metrics? What unknown external factors like climate change or unforeseen technological advancements could drastically alter Graceland's economic viability and its impact on Memphis in the coming decades? And are we prepared to measure them?